All right, let's get those brain cows milked. World War I or World War II? Let's go. Okay, so before we dive into the trenches of World War I, you need to understand how in the world did we get here. Well, it wasn't like one single cause that just popped up out of nowhere. Instead, you need to think about all of these causes, kind of like soup. Each ingredient adds flavor to the next until you have this rich, flavorful stew, which is World War I. So let's toss these ingredients into our pot. First, we got militarism. What's that? It's the glorification of the military in an arms race. And boy howdy, was there an arms race going on in Europe? You see, Germany and Britain were especially interested in building up their navies. Germany was all, hey, why do you get to have a bigger navy than me? That's not fair. And Britain was all, because I paid for it first. Germany was all, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna build even more ships. Britain was all, oh yeah, well, I've got coal. And Germany was all, oh yeah, well, I'm gonna form an alliance with Austria-Hungary. And then they both were all, oh yeah, well, I called my friend Italy. And then they all were all, oh yeah, well, we're all in a triple alliance. Then France and Russia and Britain were all, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't sound fair. And then they were all, oh yeah, well, we're all in a triple entente now. And then everyone was all, oh yeah, well now I'm scared. So they all built up their armies and navies to prepare for war. But having a large army and navy meant that each nation had to collect tons of raw materials to make all of the supplies needed to equip and feed all of those soldiers. So that means they were constantly in competition for colonies around the world where they could gather resources. And that brings us to our next ingredient, imperialism. You see, European countries were racing to build up their empires overseas, especially in Africa and Asia. They competed against one another to claim more land, which meant that those rivalries added to the growing tension in Europe. And then there's the fact that ethnic groups throughout Europe wanted to establish their own independent nations, which meant there was lots of nationalism going on. And if you combine nationalism with imperialism and militarism, what do you get? A mighty fine gumbo. And then you add in the final ingredient, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, who shot him? Some guy named Gavrilo Princip. Who was he? A member of a radical Serbian group known as the Black Hand. He believed that Serbs in Bosnia should be independent from Austro-Hungarian rule. After the Archduke was assassinated, a political domino effect took place. First, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Then Russia, who was a Slavic giant, felt compelled to support Serbia. Then Germany, who had promised Austria-Hungary unconditional support, declared war on them. And once Germany invaded Belgium to get to France faster, Great Britain came to the rescue of Belgium, not to mention being tied to the Antwerp Cordial. So those are the ingredients that led to World War I now. Let's take a look at the map. In the Western Front, you have France, Belgium, and the Low Countries over here, and then over here is Germany. In the Eastern Front, you have Russia over here, and Germany and Austria-Hungary over here. In the Southern Front, you have Italy and Austria-Hungary fighting over the Alps. And finally, in the Middle Eastern Front, you have the British fighting the Ottoman Empire. Oh, and do unforget about the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman government against its Armenian subjects during this time. Okay, so now let's talk about the deadliest weapon of World War I, and that was the machine gun. I mean, guys, these things could fire 600 bullets a minute. It was basically the predator to the human prey. But that meant any sort of frontal assault would be suicide. So instead, what happened? Trench warfare. Here's what it looked like. You have this nice open field over here, and this nice open field over here. And in between the fields are barbed wire, machine guns, and miles upon miles of trenches. And the reason why they're in a trench is because life in a trench sucked bad. There was mud, rats, poison gas, no sanitation, and machine guns. And since the war was mostly static, meaning there was no real movement, soldiers spent lots of time writing letters to family members, reading newspapers, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, and playing cards. And when they weren't doing that, they were trying to venture out of the trench to fight. But that was also pretty terrible because as soon as you stepped out of the trench, you were exposed to enemy fire. And if you were lucky enough to survive, there's a good chance you'd come back with shrapnel lodged in your brain. And then there was shell shock. You see, when soldiers heard artillery fire, their hearts would race, their legs would shake, and they couldn't sleep. And if you went to your commanding officer to explain what was happening to you, he might say, "Sounds like you're a coward, so we're going to put you in jail." In late 1916, two of the bloodiest battles of the entire war took place in the Western Front. First, there was the Battle of Verdun, where the Germans attacked the French at Verdun, and after 10 months of fighting, they gained less than a mile of new territory, while suffering 375,000 casualties. Then there was the Battle of the Somme, where the British attacked the Germans, and after 6 months of fighting, they advanced 5 miles, while suffering 420,000 casualties. Okay, so the year is 1917, and Russia has had enough of World War I. They entered the war on the side of the Triple Entente, but they were not prepared. Their soldiers had outdated rifles and no tanks, and their generals kept making bad decisions. So far, Russia had lost 2 million soldiers, and they weren't getting anywhere. So in March of 1917, a group of revolutionary soldiers overthrew the Tsar and established a communist government known as the Bolsheviks. They immediately pulled Russia out of World War I and turned the country into the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in the United States, people were generally isolationist, meaning they wanted to stay out of European affairs. But the Germans kept sinking ships in the Atlantic Ocean, and in 1915, they sunk a British ship carrying 128 Americans, and that outraged the public. But still, President Woodrow Wilson wanted to stay neutral. However, in 1917, the Germans sent a telegram to Mexico proposing an alliance. If Mexico joined the Central Powers, Germany would help them regain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. But of course, the British intercepted the message and showed it to the US, and that pushed the United States into the war. So in April of 1917, the US declared war on Germany. Finally, some reinforcements for the Allies. But the Germans weren't too worried, because they had a plan to defeat the US. First, they would sink as many ships as possible, carrying food and supplies to Europe. And second, they would launch a final major offensive in the spring of 1918. It worked for a while. They defeated the French at the Second Battle of the Marne, but the Americans arrived in large numbers and stopped the Germans. And by September, the Germans had been pushed back to where they started. On November 11, 1918, the Germans signed an armistice with the Allies. But what happened next? Well, let's find out. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles was the peace treaty that ended World War I. It was signed on June 28, 1919, and it was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, which was the same palace where Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. And that was probably a little bit insulting to the Germans, who had to walk through that hall every day to negotiate their surrender. Anyway, the treaty is considered a dictatorial peace because the Allied leaders, especially the French, wanted to punish Germany. And punish them they did. Germany had to accept full responsibility for starting the war. They had to give back all of Alsace-Lorraine to France, which was the region that France had lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. They had to reduce their military too. Only 100,000 men. They lost all of their colonies. They had to pay 132 billion gold marks, or about $40 billion in reparations to the Allies for the damage that they had done. Not surprisingly, Germans felt humiliated and angry. They blamed the treaty for the rise of Hitler and World War II. And that's why you always hear historians call the Treaty of Versailles a flawed peace. Okay, so let's finish up with the consequences of World War I first, the casualties. More than 20 million people died, 10 million soldiers, and 10 million civilians. Also, 21 million people were wounded. It was literally an entire generation lost to death and injury. Second, 4 empires collapsed: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. And 5 new countries were formed: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Third, the League of Nations was created in 1920 to prevent future wars. However, it was ultimately ineffective, because it had no military force to back it up. And in the 1930s, it failed to stop Japanese aggression in China and the rest of Asia, and European aggression in Africa and Eastern Europe. And fourth, World War I introduced modern warfare: tanks, airplanes, submarines, machine guns, and chemical weapons. World War II was inevitable. If you want to understand why, click right over here.